So today is the 8th day of Kislev, the 9th of December. We don't have a lot of time today. I'm sorry, I'm late. So I suggest that we skip the second part, where he's going to give he gave the Ramak's version, Moshe Cordevero's version of how to understand Gida Nashe, the sciatic nerve. And then he gives the Ariz's point of view. The Ariz's point of view is more complex. We're going to see it anyway in the continuation. We can come back to it later. So we're just going to skip over it. So in the pages that I gave you,
it's back.
In Tamei HaMitzvot by Rav Chaim Vital. Okay, so it starts here, and it's a more complex explanation. We'll skip it for now. Okay, so we'll just go straight to chapter 1. So this was the introduction. We'll come back to this, what the Arizal says. But it's very important to know that this is the development of Kabbalah. There's the early Kabbalah, which terminates and is anthologized and ordered by Rav Moshe Cordovero. We call this the Kabbalah that is based on the teachings of the Geonim, mostly. The Gaonites, they were the successors of the Talmudists, and then the philosophers. And it was all mixed up at that time. Everything was the same language. It was very, very mixed up. And we're going to see the remnants of it in a moment. And then came
from Chazal, basically, the Genoim.
Everybody's quoting from Chazal. Because Chazal have all of it.
Yeah,
but it's not.
Okay,
they don't call it Kabbalah, right?
Okay.
But the Geonim already began to understand that there's a separate field of knowledge.
I understand. You mean that's
when it started becoming a separate discipline. We have a lot of books from the Geonim. They used to, when Sholem and all his contemporaries were studying Kabbalah, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't even known. So they decided that Kabbalah was invented in Girona or in Provence in the 12th century.
Yes.
It's absolute nonsense. There was many Kabbalistic works from the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. There's plenty of stuff. It's mixed up language. It's like, for us, it's very hard to even understand what they're saying. We don't usually understand. The Ramak did a very good job of anthologizing, of bringing in many of these sources.
That's what he
even stuff
did? It was basically...
No, he also explains. He called it.
Okay.
But then he ordered it. He gave it a lot of order, and his main work was not even the part. The Pardes is where he puts everything together, but his main work was, first of all, writing a commentary in the Zohar. Even this commentary in the Zohar wasn't so well known. It wasn't printed until the 60s, called the Yahel O.
60s?
Yeah. Ora Ganuz.
Where does the Shari Ora stand in all this?
He's the 12th, 13th century, so he's already, he's still from the early Kabbalists. It's still where all the language is philosophical, and we'll see it in a second. Then you have the Arizal's Kabbalah. So what he did here, he first brought the Ramak, then he brings the Arizal, and then from chapter 1 he's going to start explaining it according to Chassidus. So we have 3 stages of Kabbalah, 3 stages of the inner teachings of the Torah, basically, that's how Chassidus sees it. So the Ramak is the early Kabbalah, then the Arizal is the middle, and Chassidus is already taking it and transforming it into psychological language that you can understand from your own experience. Whereas the early Kabbalists and the Arizal don't always give you an example from your experience, because I don't know how much they even thought that our experience was relevant to this. I'm not sure. And we talked about this in the past, that we call this, in Chabad, we call this Ishtadshelut, Itlabshut, Hashra. Cause and effect, which is the early Kabbalah, uses Ishtadshelut, Seder Ishtadshelut, the order of evolution, is the best way to call it. Then we have in the Arizal enclothement, something within something. That's the predominant mode of thought that he has. And then in Chassidus there's Hashra, which is immersion, total immersion within the divinity. So everything is immersed within divinity, and that gives a completely different picture. Chabad is usually called the immersion within the enclothement. Chabad is like in between, because it tries to find a language, because the language of immersion is very difficult. Immersion was the language used by the Baal Shem Tov. It's very, very not on the one hand, it's the most intuitive. On the other hand, it's not intuitive at all. It's like people don't get it. If you don't live it, you don't get it. When you live it, you don't even need it explained to you. It's like just clear. So Chabad tries to take the Arizal language, which is the most understandable, because enclothement is something we understand fully. We understand what it means to be garbed, to be wearing something, to be something within something, and it finds the immersion within the enclothement, like the highest level of okay, anyway, these are all discussed in Chassidus in different places. So now let's see what he says. והנה ביאור עניין הפגם, כמו שנתבאר לעיל בשם הפרדס. Okay, so what we want to understand is why, when this man, this angel, blemished Jacob, it happened according to the Pardes. Again, he was quoting the Zohar and other sources. He quotes other sources also, the Tikkunei Zohar and so on. It all happened in the Netzach and Hod, in the 2 feet. So we know that from the Torah it's 2 feet, but who said the 2 feet are Netzach and Hod? Maybe there's something else here. So the Ramak said that they're Netzach and Hod, they're victory and acknowledgement. Yuvan Bagdim, so we first have to understand, he's going to give us now a chapter on a very important concept which comes from early Kabbalah, from the Ramak, basically. The Ramak was one who, again, ordered this whole concept. And everybody uses it afterwards, and this is called, as we'll see, Rosh Toch Vesof, head and inner and end. But really, it's a beginning, middle, and end. That's really how you need to understand Rosh Toch Sof. So this is something that he explains in at least 3-4 different places in this in Derech Mitzvotecha. Each time he pretty much repeats the same thing, the same explanation. So. כי כבר נתבאר אצלנו במצוות פריאה ורבייה שעצמותו יתברך אינו מערך וסוג המידות כלל. This is easy for us, we learned this. We said that Hashem is not the midos. Hashem is not the spheros. He's not the Sefirot. He's not what he emanated. כמאמר לאו מכל אינון מידות יהיו כלל. As we say in the Tikkunei Zohar, in the introduction to Tikkunei Zohar, you are not any of these measures, meaning the Sefirot are measures. Remember, we talked about this at the very beginning of Shorosh Mitzvat Atfilah. שאפילו החוכמה, ראשית ההשתלשלות, היא כעשייה גשמית ממש אצלו. Even wisdom, which is the highest of the Sefirot, as it were, and the beginning of all evolution, is like an act for God. He acts, he makes wisdom. אלא דאפיקת 10 תיקונין וקרינן לון 10 ספירן להנהגה בהון אלמין. But rather you brought out 10 tikkunim. Tikkunim are garments, vessels. Tikkunim. Tikkun in Aramaic means a garment.
It does.
Yeah. And you call them 10 sfirot in order to run the world with them. You use them to govern the world.
Whose quote is this from again?
This is from the introduction to Tikkunei Zohar. This is the Patach Liyao, what we say every Erev Shabbos. וההנהגה הזאת, and this type of sovereignty, this type of running the world, הוא על ידי שהוא יתברך מהיר בהם בסוד איהו וחיוי וגרמו אחד. And how does Hashem run it? That he becomes one with them. He enters them, as it were. We saw all this in Shorosh Mitzvah Tefillah just recently. This whole discussion about, is the Rambam right, is the Maharal right? This was this whole discussion. And Hashem enters into them. And the language of the Zohar is that Iu v'chayoyi v'garmo yichad. He, his life force, and his vessels, garmoy is also vessels, are one. That in the Sfiros, in the world of emanation, and Atzilus, these are the Sfirot. Whenever we talk about Sfiros, we're talking about the world of Atzilus, of emanation. There, he, meaning Hashem himself, as it were, his life force, which is his light, his revelation, Chayoy is his revelation, and Garmoy and the vessel, the Sphira itself, are one. They become one. And that's what the Rambam meant when he said, and we saw this just a couple of weeks ago, Shehu HaYodea v'hu HaYadua v'hu HaDe'ah. If you take the sphere of Das, for instance, then you have within it the knower, which is Hashem, the known, which is the light, because Hashem is being known, v'hu HaDe'ah, and he is the power of knowledge is the vessel itself. ועל ידי זה נמשך אור והחיות לנבראים מעולם ועד עולם. And we said the whole reason they need Sefirot is because there has to be an intermediate that takes the infinite revelation of Hashem and turns it into something that can be defined in some way, can be grasped. Right, the Sefirot. We need them in order to bring the light and the life force down into the lower worlds, into the creation. So now all this, again, when people heard this in Kabbalah, what did they understand? They understood that he's talking like a scientific picture of reality, that this is what Kabbalah is trying to paint. It's not that it's not, but Chassidus understands this completely differently. He doesn't want to understand it on the world. It's true, it's also true of the world. But what's more relevant to us, what's more approachable, and we can better understand, more graspable, is if you understand this in the person himself. How is all this in the person? V'hem hanikreim kalim. And these Sefirot, we call them vessels, right? These Sefirot are the vessels of godliness, as it were. V'nei Sefirot em eser. Now, the big secret is, why are there 10 Sefirot? Why the number 10? This is the same problem as general culture having the question of why do we use base 10 to do mathematics. And so come the mathematicians, and in their ingenuity, they come and they say it's a fluke of nature. It's an artifact of being a human. There's no reason to do math in base 10. Maybe because we have 10 fingers, maybe because the first guy couldn't find a word for something after 10. It's not easier, not necessarily easier. If you're a computer, it's much harder. To do base 10 in computers is really difficult. Base 2 is easy, base 4 is good, base 8 is fine, 16 is great. All these are great because you use 1 and 0, so you use multiples of 2. So all those are easy if you're a computer. If you're a human, where do you have in your mind 10 categories that you would say it's easier? There's nothing in our mind that seems to say that we are more equipped to think in base 10 than in... So you go through this, there's all these books written about this, trying to figure out why in the world we use base 10. So we find that all of Kabbalah is based on base 10. Where did we get this base 10 from? So we see it in Chazal, we see it in the first real source, is the Book of Formation, Sefer Yetzirah. He says there's 10 Sefirot. And there's this, and 10 commandments, maybe 10 sayings in which the world was created. There's many things. There are 10. We just heard 10 blessings from Isaac to Jacob. There's a lot of 10s. So why? You ask yourself, so why? What's so special about this 10? So the early Kabbalists asked this question about the 10 Sefirot. They asked this question, why 10? Where do we come to 10 from? So their answers in their time were geometrical. They use geometry. Basically, you can say that from the time of the Greeks until recently, and even now, one of the best, call it, natural things in the world to use, to think about thinking, is geometry. Right? Plato spends half his dialogues doing geometry with people and showing them it's like this, it's like that, and showing them that geometry is natural to the person. It's some knowledge that we already have ingrained within us. Trying to show that this is a good idea to start with. Chassidus doesn't disagree with this. It just says I have something better. Geometry is very nice. By the way, all of Eitz Chaim starts with geometry. It's all geometry. Spinoza, when he started his thinking, Chakira Elokit, his thinking about God, he also uses entirely geometry. This was one of the staples of all human thought for the last 3,000 years. Thinking about geometry and saying from geometry we learn this. So what did they do? So they said something very simple. I'm not going to get into it. The Ramak, and almost at the beginning of this book, the Pardes, he devotes a whole chapter to it. How do you get from geometry to 10 Sefirot? Why is 10 the natural thing to start with? Okay, he has this thing, we're not going to get into it. He has a whole discussion between the early Kabbalists, Rabbi Azriel and Rabbi Yehuda Chayat, and all these discussions, and in the end...
Some geometric figure that...
Yeah, and basically it's that you have width, length, and depth, and each one has three degrees to it. A beginning and end, because it's like they look at each one as like a line. It has a beginning, an end, and a middle. So each one of them has 3, so that's 9. And then they say the point where they all connect, that's the 10. That in general is the picture. Again, somebody would read this and say, what's zemuchach? Is this some necessary conclusion you come to? I don't think that, no, they start with they're trying to, again, like we're trying to explain, why do we use base 10? Okay, so tomorrow we'll see how Chassidus explains 10 Sefirot. Because Chassidus has a completely different explanation. It's got nothing to do with geometry, it's got nothing to do with, although it doesn't disagree. Again, it doesn't say that we're not geometric. We are. We'll see it as we went on. We hinted to it yesterday, Gidon Sheikh was 377. That's a geometric finding. We'll see it later.
Wait.
Right.